December 8, 1941, 0645 hours. Clark Field, Luzon, Philippines. The air smells of aviation fuel and wet grass, and the sky above the runway is the pale, bruised color of a morning that has not yet decided what it wants to become. 12 fighters sit in a ragged row along the flight line, their curved fuselages catching the first orange light, and on the nose of each one, a painted shark's mouth grins back at the jungle. It is to the pilots stumbling toward their cockpits half-dressed, the most American image imaginable. Teeth bared, defiant, almost cartoonish in its bravado. It is the image the recruiting posters back home would have used. It is not the image of what these aircraft actually are. What the posters never showed was the truth sitting in the cockpit of every P-40 Warhawk on that runway. An engine with no supercharger worth a name above 15,000 feet. An airframe already a full generation behind the machines it was about to meet in the sky, and a pilot corps that had trained for a war that had, technically speaking, already started 3 hours earlier over Pearl Harbor and simply hadn't reached them yet. The teeth on the nose were paint. The vulnerability underneath them was structural, mechanical, engineered into the machine from its first blueprint. And in less than an hour, that vulnerability would be tested against 60 Japanese Zero fighters and bombers converging on Clark Field from the north. Somewhere on that flight line was a panel of skin bolted just aft of one aircraft's exhaust stacks. Its shark's teeth, still wet from a touch-up the ground crew had finished the night before. That panel would survive December 8th. It would survive a dozen more mornings after that, bolted to an airframe that kept flying long after men far smarter than its designers had said it should have been retired. This is the story of the aircraft nobody expected to matter, flown by pilots nobody expected to survive, holding a line that for a period of months longer than anyone in Washington wanted to admit had absolutely nothing else standing behind it. The P-40 Warhawk was born from compromise, and compromise, in the business of building fighter aircraft, is another word for future casualties. In 1938, Curtiss-Wright engineers took an existing airframe, the P-36 Hawk, and married it to a new liquid-cooled Allison V-1710 engine, producing a fighter that was faster in a straight line than its predecessor, but carried inside it a single, unforgivable flaw. The Allison engine had no two-stage supercharger. Above 15,000 feet, where the Luftwaffe's Messerschmitts and the Imperial Japanese Navy Zeros would fight their wars, the P-40's engine began gasping like a man climbing stairs with a stone in his chest. This was not a rumor whispered by rival manufacturers. It was measured, documented, understood by the United States Army Air Corps before a single production unit rolled off the line in Buffalo, New York. And yet 15,000 feet is a number, and numbers alone do not explain why young men climbed into these machines and flew them into combat anyway. The number becomes something else entirely when you understand what it meant on a given morning over the Philippines, or over the deserts outside Tobruk, or above the jungle canopy of New Guinea. It meant that in a vertical fight, in a straight climbing duel toward the sun, the P-40 pilot would lose ground, second by second, to an enemy who did not have to fight fair to win. 13,738 P-40s were eventually built across the aircraft's production run, a number that on its own means nothing until you understand it as 13,738 separate promises made to young men that the machine beneath them, whatever its faults, was the best that American industry could deliver at the moment the world went to war. The nickname came early, and it came honestly. British pilots in North Africa called their version the Tomahawk and later the Kitty Hawk. But American ground crews in the Pacific had already started calling the plane the Warhawk before the paperwork made it official, because that is what it looked like sitting on a jungle airstrip with its nose art-bared, and because a nickname born from affection survives longer than one assigned by a procurement office. The men who flew it did not choose it because it was the best fighter available. They flew it because, in December of 1941, it was the only fighter available in numbers that mattered, stationed in the places where the war was about to begin. What nobody in that cockpit could have known, staring out at a peaceful morning runway in the Philippines, was that the aircraft's single greatest weakness, its inability to outclimb an enemy, would force an entire generation of American pilots to invent a new way of fighting altogether, one that would outlive the aircraft itself and reshape how American fighters fought for the rest of the war. But something strange was happening in those skies over the Pacific that first week of December, something the men on the ground could feel in their stomachs before they understood it in their heads. Boyd Wagner was 25 years old on the morning the war found him, a lieutenant with the 17th Pursuit Squadron stationed at Nichols Field outside Manila, and he had spent the better part of a year quietly convinced that the P-40 was a better aircraft than its reputation suggested, provided a man understood exactly what it could and could not do. He was not a natural showman, not the kind of pilot who collected nicknames in bar fights, but he had spent hours in the cockpit running his aircraft through maneuvers other pilots considered a waste of fuel, learning precisely where the edge of the Warhawk's performance envelope lived and precisely how close he could fly to that edge without falling off it. On December 12th, for days after Clark Field burned, Wagner led a flight against a Japanese landing force at Apari, on the northern coast of Luzon, and there discovered what would become the signature lesson of the entire P-40 war: dive speed. The Warhawk, heavy in the nose and built with a robust airframe that could absorb punishment most contemporary fighters could not, was capable of diving away from a fight at speeds that left the more delicate Japanese Zero struggling to follow without risking structural failure of its own lightly built wings. Wagner attacked from altitude, dove through the formation, fired, and dove again, refusing every invitation to climb and turn with an enemy who could outturn him in his sleep. In a single sortie that day, flying alone after his wingmen became separated in the chaos, Wagner shot down 5 confirmed Japanese aircraft, becoming the first American ace of the Second World War before most of the country back home had finished processing the news from Pearl Harbor 5 days earlier. 5 aircraft in a single flight sounds, on paper, like a statistic destined for a recruiting poster, and it was used as one. But translate the number into what it actually meant on the ground at Nichols Field that evening. It meant one exhausted, powder-burned young man climbing out of a cockpit that smelled of cordite and hot oil, understanding with total clarity that he had just proven, in the space of 20 minutes, that the aircraft everyone in Washington had already begun quietly writing off as obsolete could still kill the enemy's best fighter if flown by a man willing to refuse the fight the enemy wanted. Wagner would be dead within 2 years, killed not in combat, but in a flying accident stateside in 1942, a fact that would later feel to the men who served under him like the war taking something back that it had no right to take. Captain Ito, flying escort for a bomber formation over northern Luzon that same week, would later describe the American fighters he encountered as clumsy, barrel-shaped machines flown by men who seemed to know only one trick: running away toward the ground the moment a fight turned difficult. It was, in Captain Ito's assessment, not a tactic. It was cowardice wearing the shape of a tactic. He would have cause to revise that opinion, but not yet and not without cost. What nobody on either side of that fight yet understood was that Wagner's dive-and-disengage approach was not desperation. It was the opening chapter of a doctrine that would define how outnumbered, outclimbed American fighter pilots survived for the next 18 months, and it was about to be tested against the most feared aviators in the Pacific theater. By the summer of 1942, the P-40 had found its most famous home not in the American military at all, but in a mercenary volunteer force flying under Chinese nationalist colors, painted with a shark's mouth so distinctive it would come to define the aircraft in American popular memory more than any single military campaign ever could. The American Volunteer Group, soon nicknamed the Flying Tigers by the press, was the creation of a retired Army officer named Claire Chennault, a man who had spent years studying Japanese aerial combat doctrine and had concluded, against the prevailing wisdom of nearly every air power theorist of his generation, that the P-40's supposed weaknesses could be turned into a coherent, repeatable system of survival and victory. Chennault's doctrine was simple to describe and brutally difficult to execute under fire. Never dogfight a zero in a turning contest. Attack only from a position of altitude advantage. Fire in short, disciplined bursts, and dive away the instant the advantage was lost, using the Warhawk's superior diving speed and structural strength as the escape hatch the Zero could never follow through. It required a kind of discipline that ran against every instinct a fighter pilot carries into his first combat, the instinct to stay and finish what you started. Pilots who abandoned the doctrine and tried to outturn a Zero rarely survived long enough to regret it. One of those pilots was a young Texan named Robert Duke Hedman, who on his very first combat mission over Kunming in December of 1941 found himself separated from his flight and alone against an incoming formation of Japanese bombers and their fighter escort. Rather than climb into a fight his aircraft could not win, Hedman held Chennault's discipline against every instinct screaming at him to do otherwise, diving through the formation, firing, disengaging, climbing back to altitude, and diving again for separate times until he had shot down 4 enemy aircraft and become an ace before his first combat mission had even ended. The 4 confirmed kills meant, in the arithmetic of a green pilot on his debut sortie, that the doctrine Chennault had built around this supposedly obsolete aircraft was not theory. It was a system that could turn a nervous 23-year-old with barely any combat training into a killer of veteran enemy aviators, provided he trusted the machine's one genuine advantage and refused every temptation to abandon it. The shark's mouth painted across the nose of every flying Tiger P-40 had originally been copied, almost as a joke, from a photograph of British Kitty Hawks fighting in North Africa. But by the time the Japanese pilots over Burma and southern China had encountered it a dozen times, the design had stopped being decoration and started being a warning. What happened next defied every tactical assumption Japanese air commanders had built their Pacific campaign around, because the machine they had already dismissed as inferior was in the hands of pilots who understood exactly what it could and could not do, killing their most experienced aviators at a rate their own intelligence services struggled to explain. While the Sharkmouth Warhawks fought over the jungles of Burma and China, an entirely different theater was writing its own chapter of the P-40's war across the sand and rock of North Africa, where the Royal Air Force and later the United States Army Air Forces flew the aircraft under the name Kitty Hawk against German and Italian pilots defending Rommel's supply lines. The desert offered no jungle canopy to hide beneath, and no monsoon weather to interrupt the fighting, only flat, merciless visibility in every direction and heat that turned aluminum cockpits into ovens before a pilot had even started his engine. German fighter pilots flying the superior Messerschmitt Bf 109 initially treated the Kitty Hawks assigned to escort Allied bombers and attack ground targets with the same dismissive confidence Captain Ito had shown over Luzon months earlier. An Italian fighter pilot flying alongside German forces over Tobruk in mid-1942 recorded in a post-war interview his squadron's early assessment of the American-built fighters. They were slow to climb, unglamorous in the turn, and seemed designed by men who had never actually intended their pilots to survive a serious engagement. It was, in his words, an aircraft that inspired more pity than fear. That assessment began to erode not through any single dramatic engagement, but through accumulated attrition, mission after mission in which Kitty Hawks operating at low altitude, close to the desert floor, where their lack of a supercharger mattered far less, tore apart German supply columns, armored vehicles, and forward airfields with a durability the more delicate Messerschmitts could not match when hit by ground fire. The P-40's rugged airframe, built heavy and over-engineered by the standards of its era, absorbed anti-aircraft damage that would have brought down a lighter fighter, allowed pilots to limp home on engines streaming oil and airframes riddled with holes that, on paper, should have ended the flight in the sand miles short of the runway. German intelligence had failed to notice one catastrophic detail buried in their own after-action reports. The Kitty Hawks they kept reporting as destroyed in low-altitude, strafing runs kept reappearing on the flight line within days, repaired by ground crews who had learned to treat the aircraft's structural toughness as a resource worth exploiting rather than an accident of design. By the autumn of 1942, the same painted panel that had first grinned across the nose of a Warhawk over Clark Field in December of the previous year had, through the ordinary rotation of aircraft between theaters and repair depots, found its way onto a Kitty Hawk assigned to a joint Anglo-American squadron operating out of a forward strip near El Alamein. The paint was no longer fresh. Sand had scoured it dull in places. A line of small punctures near the upper jaw told the story of a burst of anti-aircraft fire that had passed close enough to kill the pilot on a different day. And the Shark's single visible eye had been retouched so many times by ground crews with no formal training in art that it had taken on an asymmetrical, almost wounded expression entirely unintended by whoever painted it first. Ground crews in every theater the P-40 fought in developed a similar relationship with these panels, treating the nose art less as decoration and more as a kind of unofficial service record, a visible ledger of survival painted directly onto the machine that had earned it. Mechanics who serviced these aircraft between missions, working through desert heat or tropical humidity with tools that broke as often as the parts they were meant to fix, understood something about the P-40 that pilots occasionally forgot in the adrenaline of combat. This was not an elegant aircraft, not a masterpiece of aerodynamic theory, but it was an honest one, built to be repaired in the field by exhausted men working with limited spare parts, forgiving of the abuse that combat and improvised maintenance inevitably inflicted on it. One story from this period, documented in the personal correspondence of an American crew chief serving in North Africa, describes a Kitty Hawk returning from a strafing mission with over 140 separate holes counted across its wings and fuselage, an aircraft that by any reasonable engineering standard should have been scrapped on the spot. The crew chief and 2 enlisted men worked through the night by lamplight, patching the skin, replacing a damaged aileron cable, and had the aircraft flying again by dawn. 140 holes translated in the language of the men on that flight line, not into a statistic about battle damage, but into a promise kept. The same pilot flew that same aircraft on a mission the following morning, carried by a machine that refused, structurally and mechanically, to accept that it was finished. Perhaps the ultimate vindication for this design came when squadron commanders across multiple theaters began specifically requesting P-40s for low-altitude ground attack roles, even after superior high-altitude fighters like the P-38 and the Spitfire had become available in sufficient numbers to replace them entirely. The aircraft that had been dismissed as obsolete before the war even began had, by simple virtue of surviving punishment nothing else in the theater could survive, made itself irreplaceable in exactly the role its designers had never intended. The doctrine Chennault had built for the Flying Tigers did not remain confined to China and Burma. It traveled, carried by pilots who rotated between theaters, and by after-action reports that circulated through every American fighter command desperate for any tactical edge against a Japanese Zero that could outturn and outclimb virtually everything the Allies had in the air in 1942. The lesson, distilled into its simplest form for pilots with only weeks of training before being thrown into combat, was this: never fight the enemy's fight, always fight your own, and trust the dive. A young second lieutenant named Andrew Reynolds, flying P-40s with the 49th Fighter Group, defending Darwin, Australia, against Japanese air raids in early 1942, became one of the clearest examples of this doctrine's cost when improperly applied and its value when respected. On his second combat mission, still carrying the instincts of a training environment that had emphasized aggressive turning fights, Reynolds attempted to outmaneuver a Zero in a tight horizontal turn and found himself, within seconds, staring down the barrel of an enemy fighter that had simply outturned him with room to spare. He survived only because a wingman, flying the doctrine correctly, dove through the fight and forced the Zero to break off. Reynolds later wrote in a letter home that the experience taught him more in 11 seconds than 11 weeks of flight school had managed, and from that mission forward, he flew every engagement according to Chennault's principles, ending the war credited with several confirmed victories, all of them won from a dive he never abandoned again. The doctrine's brutal mathematics meant that a pilot's survival in the P-40 was determined less by raw flying talent and more by discipline, by the willingness to refuse an instinctive fight in favor of a calculated one. And this reality reshaped how the United States trained its fighter pilots for the remainder of the war, well beyond the P-40's own service life. Captain Ito, by mid-1942, flying combat missions over New Guinea rather than the Philippines, began noting in his own recollections a growing frustration among his fellow pilots, an unease that had not existed 6 months earlier. The American fighters, he observed, no longer flew like men caught by surprise. They flew like men who understood exactly what their aircraft could do and exactly what it could not, and that understanding was beginning to cost Japan pilots it could not easily replace. By the middle of 1942, the character of the air war over New Guinea had shifted in a way that neither side had fully anticipated when the campaign began, and it was here, in the humid, mountainous jungle terrain of the South Pacific, that the P-40 fought what many veterans of the theater would later describe as its defining campaign. Japan's early war fighter pilots, among the most experienced and highly trained aviators in the world at the outset of the conflict, were dying in numbers their training pipeline could not replace, while the pilots flying against them, many of them barely out of flight school, were being kept alive by a machine whose single greatest virtue was that it forgave mistakes an unforgiving enemy would not. This was the theater's climax, and its arithmetic told a story no propaganda office needed to embellish. American industrial production, by 1943, had reached a scale that allowed replacement P-40s, replacement pilots, and replacement parts to flow into the Pacific theater faster than Japan's more rigid training and manufacturing systems could match, even as Japanese aircraft on paper continued to outperform the Warhawk in nearly every individual category of speed, climb rate, and turning radius. 13,738 P-40s were eventually built. More steel and industrial determination poured into a single airframe than Japan's entire wartime economy could hope to match plane for plane, and every one of those aircraft represented another young man given a fighting chance against pilots who, individually, were often more skilled than he was. It was during this period that Captain Ito, now a veteran of nearly a year of combat against these aircraft he had once dismissed with contempt, recorded what would become his second documented shift in assessment. The American pilots, he wrote, no longer felt like men flying an inferior machine. They felt like men who understood their machine so completely that its limitations had stopped matching. This was not doubt anymore. This was something closer to fear, the specific fear of an experienced hunter who has begun to realize that his prey has learned the shape of the trap. The human cost of this reckoning fell on both sides in staggering proportion, and it fell hardest on the ground crews and pilots who kept flying missions in aircraft that were, by any honest technical assessment, being outclassed by newer Japanese fighters entering service. A P-40 squadron operating out of Port Moresby in late 1942 recorded a mission tempo of multiple sorties per day for weeks without rotation, an operational pace that meant exhausted pilots climbing into cockpits on 4 hours of sleep. Flying missions where a single lapse in concentration meant death, not because the aircraft failed them, but because the human body flying it had reached the outer edge of what it could endure. This was the true climax of the P-40's war, not a single dramatic battle, but the slow, grinding, absolutely inevitable demonstration that American industrial capacity, combined with a doctrine built specifically around this aircraft's honest limitations, would outlast Japan's ability to replace its finest pilots, no matter how skilled those pilots individually were. By 1943, the terror that had begun as isolated doubt among Japanese fighter pilots had metastasized into something closer to institutional dread within Japanese Army and Navy air commands operating across the Pacific theater. Intelligence reports circulated among Japanese squadrons warning pilots against pursuing American fighters into a dive, a warning that would have been unthinkable 18 months earlier when the P-40 was still being dismissed as a barrel-shaped relic unworthy of serious tactical concern. The aircraft that Japanese pilots had once treated as an easy kill had become, through nothing more dramatic than disciplined repetition of a single tactical principle, an opponent that experienced Japanese aviators had learned to respect and, in growing numbers, to fear. A third documented story from this period involves a P-40 P-40 pilot named Charles Older, flying with the China Air Task Force in 1943, whose combat record over the preceding 2 years had made him one of the most experienced American fighter pilots in the entire Pacific theater. Older's approach to combat had been shaped entirely by Chennault's original doctrine from his earliest days with the Flying Tigers, and by 1943 he had refined it into something approaching instinct. A pilot who no longer needed to consciously calculate the angle of his dive or the moment to disengage, because years of disciplined repetition had made the decision automatic. On one mission over southern China, Older's flight intercepted a formation of Japanese bombers escorted by fighters that outnumbered his own flight nearly 2-1, and rather than retreat, he executed the diving attack doctrine with such precision that his flight destroyed multiple enemy aircraft without losing a single American pilot, a ratio that would have seemed impossible to the men who first flew the P-40 into combat over the Philippines 2 years earlier. Captain Ito, flying his final combat missions of the war in 1944 as Japan's fighter pilot corps buckled under the combined weight of American industrial production and accumulated combat losses among its most experienced aviators, wrote what would become the most striking entry in his wartime record. The aircraft he had first dismissed as a clumsy, barrel-shaped joke, flown by cowards who ran toward the ground rather than fight honestly, had, in his own words, taught the Imperial Japanese Army Air Force a lesson it had refused to learn until the lesson had already cost it the war, that an aircraft's weaknesses matter far less than the discipline of the men who understand them, and that America's willingness to build machines by the tens of thousands, however individually imperfect, would always defeat an enemy who built fewer, better aircraft flown by pilots it could not afford to lose. By 1944, the P-40's frontline combat role had begun its gradual, inevitable decline, not because the aircraft had failed, but because America's industrial machine had finally produced enough P-38 Lightnings, P-47 Thunderbolts, and P-51 Mustangs to replace an airframe whose fundamental design limitations, honest and understood since before the war began, had simply been overtaken by newer engineering. This was not a defeat. It was a graduation, the quiet retirement of an aircraft that had done exactly what it was needed to do during the exact years America had nothing better available in sufficient numbers, handing off its duties to successors it had, in a very real sense, bought the time to design and build. The pilots who had flown the P-40 through its hardest years did not speak of the aircraft's retirement with relief. Interviews and letters collected from surviving Flying Tigers and P-40 veterans across multiple theaters, conducted decades after the war, consistently describe an affection for the aircraft that outlasted its combat service by half a century. A loyalty rooted not in the machine's performance statistics, but in the simple, undeniable fact that it had carried them home when better aircraft, flown less carefully, might not have. Robert Hedman, the young Texan who had become an ace on his first combat mission, would later describe the P-40 not as the best fighter of the war, but as the fighter that had taught an entire generation of American pilots how to survive against an enemy who should have killed them, a lesson that outlived the aircraft and shaped how the United States trained its fighter pilots for the remainder of the century. By war's end, the P-40 had been flown by the air forces of at least 28 different nations, an international footprint matched by few other American aircraft of the era. Evidence that the honest, unglamorous durability Curtiss had built into the design had value that extended far beyond the specific tactical circumstances of the Pacific and North African campaigns. It had fought over jungles, deserts, and oceans, escorted by pilots who had never expected it to be the aircraft that decided their war, and it had, in nearly every theater where it served, outlasted the low expectations that had greeted its arrival. The wreck sits today in a stretch of New Guinea jungle that has spent 8 decades quietly reclaiming what the war left behind. Vines threading through a wing spar, a tree root grown directly through what remains of the cockpit frame. The engine long since stripped by scavengers or corroded past recognition by tropical humidity that never once, in all those years, stopped working. But the nose section, When researchers and aviation historians finally located and documented the site decades after the war, still carried, beneath a crust of rust and jungle rot, the unmistakable curve of a shark's mouth, the same panel, the same paint, the same aircraft that had once sat gleaming on a runway at Clark Field on a December morning in 1941. Teeth bared at an enemy who had not yet learned to be afraid of it. That panel today rests in a small regional museum collection, cleaned, stabilized, but deliberately left unrestored, its scorched paint and shrapnel scars preserved exactly as they were found, because the museum's curators understood something the aircraft's own designers might not have anticipated. The damage was not a flaw to be hidden. It was the record. It was the same object that had grinned defiance at an enemy fighter over Luzon, that had absorbed anti-aircraft fragments over the desert outside El Alamein, that had been patched by exhausted mechanics working through the night by lamplight, and that had, against every reasonable engineering assessment made about it before the war even began, carried men home who had no right, statistically speaking, to expect to come home at all. Captain Ito, in the final recorded interview of his life, conducted decades after the war had ended, was asked which American aircraft he had feared most across his years of combat in the Pacific. He did not name the P-38, faster and more heavily armed. He did not name the later, more powerful Mustang. He named the P-40, the aircraft he had once mocked as a barrel-shaped joke over the skies of Luzon, and he explained, in words that closed the exact circle his own arrogance had opened years earlier, that fear in combat was never about which machine was faster. It was about which enemy had learned, through discipline and sacrifice, exactly how to make an imperfect machine unbeatable within the narrow terms it was built to fight on. What remains unresolved, and what historians continue to debate to this day, is the precise identity of the pilot who flew that specific aircraft on its final mission. The records lost sometime between the chaos of the New Guinea campaign and the decades of jungle decay that followed, leaving only a serial number partially legible on a data plate and a shark's mouth that has outlasted every man who ever sat behind it. Somewhere in an archive, or perhaps nowhere at all anymore, there may exist a final flight log that would answer the question. Until it surfaces, if it ever does, the aircraft keeps its secret the same way it kept its pilots alive for 2 years when nothing else in America's arsenal was there to do the job. Quietly, imperfectly, and against every expectation that it should have failed.